Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining me. Let's chat for a few minutes about Joseph and His Brothers by Thomas Mann, which I recently finished. And following this chat, I will also touch base briefly on what I'm currently reading, as well as what my planned next read is going to be. But for now, let's chat about Joseph and His Brothers by Thomas Mann. This was originally published in an English translation in 1948 as a single volume, but it was originally published in 4 different books in German over the course of about 10 years. The different books are called, the first one's called The Stories of Jacob in 1933. The second one's called The Young Joseph, published in 1934. Joseph in Egypt was published in 1936, and then Joseph the Provider was published in 1943. From what I read of the publication history, the first 2 were published in Berlin, then World War II was brewing, so the third one was published in Vienna, and then the fourth one, which was published in 1943, which was during the war. I believe Thomas Mann was living in the U.S. at the time, but this was published in German in Stockholm in 1943, from what I can tell. Although Thomas Mann always considered this to be one work, even though it was published in different books. So he considered this his magnum opus. He considered this his major work. And wow, it's pretty amazing. So we'll get to more about it here in a bit. But I just wanted to chat a bit about this volume. This physical book itself is an Everyman's Library edition that I read, published in 2005 by Alfred A. Knopf and translated by John E. Woods. This Everyman's Library edition is just so well done. This is a really big book with pretty small font on the pages. It's about 1,500 pages, but you can just open it anywhere, and it was just, even back here in the very back, it's just so easy to read because it was just so published so well. It's got this really pretty red underneath the dust jacket, this red binding. I just thought it was such a beautiful publication. I'll show you the title page here. There's the title page. I just loved it. So I loved it as a physical object. But back to the book itself. So why I read it. So my priority reading list, I had this theme for 2018. I had this theme of foundational myths. And so the Joseph story, from the Bible, is really a foundational myth for Judaism. And then Judaism, of course, ultimately Christianity developed from Judaism, as did Islam. So this story appears in several major religions and is foundational to really, I guess, all 3 major religions. And it's just an amazing mythological tale. I didn't even realize, how amazing, but we'll talk about it more here in a bit. What I thought I would do is, in the different books, so this, like I mentioned, is 4 different books in one volume. Thomas Mann considered it one book, really. So it's really just, Joseph and His Brothers, but I thought I would break it down by the different books. So the first book's called The Stories of Jacob. Jacob is Joseph's father. Oh, I should say, you don't necessarily need to know too much about the Joseph story to really get into this book if you like mythology. If you like Joseph Campbell and this sort of, archetypical myth, stories of myth, epically mythological, then, you might enjoy this, because this is kind of what it's going for, I think. But to understand Joseph, we really need to step back, to his father. Where did Joseph come from? Jacob. Jacob is Joseph's father. And so book 1 really concerns Jacob's life as kind of a young man. He has to leave due to a trickery with his father and Esau. His brother Esau, he leaves, and he goes to stay with a relative that's kind of far away, and he ends up meeting at a well. He meets Rachel, this young woman that he instantly falls in love with and wants to marry. So he asks her dad for her, and then the dad says, no, you have to work for 7 years. So he does this work for 7 years. I think it's 7 years, and then there's a kind of a mix. There's a switcheroo done, and Jacob winds up, unbeknownst to himself, marrying the sister Leah, who he did not love. So he marries Leah. Then he has to work another, I think, 7 years to be able to marry Rachel. This is, of course, this is about 1400 BC is when all this is taking place. So we're talking about the age of definitely polygamy. So he ends up marrying these two sisters, and then he ends up having 12 sons. So, of whom Joseph is one. But he ends up having 12 sons by Leah, two of his wives, and then two of their handmaids, two of their servants. So he ends up having basically these 4 wives, although I think the 2 handmaids aren't technically wives. Only Rachel and Leah are technically wives, if I understood that right. So anyway, Joseph is really his... Rachel, I don't want to give a lot away, because even though this is kind of an old story that's in several religions, and so some people may know it really, really well, some people might not know it so well, and so there is an element of spoilers here, because especially in book 3, I'll talk about more here in a bit. It was kind of a page turner, because I didn't know how it was going to turn out at that point. I mean, I kind of knew how it all ended at the very end, but I didn't really know, the details. So I don't want to give away anything that's going to be considered that would deter from reading the story from anyone who does not know the story that well. So anyway, Joseph, to make a long story short, is Jacob's favorite son. And there are reasons for that that have to do with Rachel, his true wife. He calls her his true wife, is Joseph's mother, and she ends up kind of dying young, and so Jacob sees Rachel in Joseph, and so he's sort of his favorite. So. Anyway, book 2 is called The Young Joseph, and Joseph is a beautiful guy. He is a beautiful youth. Even as he's like 17 years old, which is kind of where we start his story, he's already beautiful. And he's not only beautiful and handsome, he's turn your head beautiful. I mean, he's gasping people, he catches people's attention. But he's got another thing going for him, and that is he's very, very intelligent. And so beauty combined with intelligence, gets a person, can take a person places, right? But that's also, it's very dangerous. And so the young Joseph doesn't necessarily know how to use these gifts that well. Because he has this effect on people, he thinks that everyone loves him just by default. And so he takes it for granted. Well, his brothers aren't so enamored of him, right? Because his brothers are jealous. He has 12 brothers, and they... all but one of them, so 10 of them, are really, really, really jealous of Joseph because of his relationship, his very, very close relationship with his father. So his mother had been given a bridal veil thing, and it has a name. I've forgotten the name. Joseph wants this, and so he has his dad wrapped around his finger. So he talks to his dad, convinces his dad to give him this thing. It turns out to be the coat of many colors, and he wears it around. His brothers just hate him. They wind up trying to plot a way to get rid of him, and they actually contemplate killing him, which they almost do, and they throw him into a well, but they wind up selling him into slavery. So he gets sold into slavery, where he's ultimately taken down into Egypt and sold again. So the 3rd book is called Joseph in Egypt, and so this is where he starts out life as a slave, but he starts trying, he's in this house of a courtier, or a bureaucrat, I guess, of Pharaoh, a really highly placed guy. So Joseph winds up sort of, doing well and sort of advancing in this household. Well, as I mentioned, though, right, he's beautiful. He's very, very handsome. This administrator is a eunuch who's married. Because of the way the custom is, he's had to be castrated. As a little child, his parents make this decision to send him into court service. They have to castrate him, and he becomes a eunuch. So he's a eunuch, but he's married and stuff. But his wife, obviously they do not have a sexual relationship. So over time, Joseph talk about sexual harassment. This book 3 has got the epitome of sexual harassment in it, because Joseph is a slave, right? He has to do kind of what he's told on the one hand. On the other hand, he has to maintain his honor, because an ongoing theme here is the monotheism of Jacob. The religion, the proto-Judaism that is being developed at this time. Joseph follows this, even though he's in the land of Egypt, which is considered, his father hates the land of Egypt. Jacob thinks it's just a land of abominations, and so Joseph really tries to stay true to his principles and to his sort of spirituality and religion, and he is chaste. He hasn't ever had sex with anybody, and nor does he want to, much less his boss's wife. But so this is kind of plays out in book 3. He winds up, I don't want to give that away too much because that was kind of a page turner to me. He winds up, though, in a different position. He has lots of ups and downs in his life. He has to start over several times. He winds up in book 4, then, though, in a different set of circumstances where he again finds himself low and raised up, is a common phrase in the book, where he ultimately then becomes very, very close to Pharaoh. The Pharaoh that's depicted in this sort of historical fiction is Akhenaten, the Pharaoh who tried to institute monotheism into Egypt. So I thought it's just very, very cool the way this is done. I'm going to run out of time. I mean, I could spend hours on this book because, needless to say, it's 1,500 pages, so there's a lot to go through. But a few things I wanted to say about it was this myth. Just the one overarching theme that I took away from the book was that myth is the foundation of reality, that we're all living in myths, that myths are part of our lives. It's the structure of reality is myth. And so this idea recurs through this book over and over and over again, where one person becomes another person. There's a certain androgyny to it as well, where Joseph at some point will be his mother, and the different people, take on different forms. So this is very kind of cool because it's just very it's very much a myth building, sort of a Joseph Campbell archetypical, the archetypes of life. And to me, it was just sort of trying to say that myth under sort of is the basis of all reality. The other thing is story. So myth and story, sort of the same thing. But Joseph actually says sometimes, we're in a story. So he comments to other people, like, what part are you going to play in this story? He thought of himself as being in an epic story. He believed he was in an epic story being written by, his God. And so he wanted to behave as if he were in this myth. He was making his own myth, the myth of his life. And so he thought of himself in a story. There's actually a quote from the book that says, on page 954, do consider the possibility, indeed the probability, that we are in a story. And we're all in a story, right? We're all in the story of our own lives. And so I think that was really cool, too, to think of it that way, that, Joseph was in the myth of his own life, was in the story of his own life. And so we are too. And then other people enter into his story. And so he would caution them, like, what part are you going to play in my story? And so I think that's another thing that I took away from it was that, you never know. You're not only in your own story, but you're in everyone around you's story. So how are you going to behave in the story? What part are you going to play? What mythological person, what mythological pattern are you going to repeat in your story and in the story of others, those that you're involved with? So I just thought that was so cool. So I'm going to run out of time, but on page 1283, there was another quote that says, anyone can know the story, but to be present at it, that was the thing. So you might know the story of Jacob, but, to be present at it. This book really put us present in the story. It's not just a matter of knowing this happened, then this happened, then this happened. This really puts you in the story, like, majorly. So I'm going to run out of time. I'm going to end the chat with that and just talk a bit about what I'm currently reading. The Snail on the Slope by the Strugatsky brothers. This is Soviet-era science fiction. It takes place in two different worlds. And one called The Administration above, and then below is the Forest. And I'm only about 10% in, so I'm not real. I'm still sort of finding my way in both of these worlds. I haven't been introduced very much to the Forest yet, but I'll get there. Then after that, I'm going to plan on reading The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett. This is some mid-century hard-boiled detective fiction. I read some earlier this year. I read The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler, so I'm going to get some Dashiell Hammett read coming up following The Snail on the Slope. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, take care. Bye.